welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by the author of a novella that I've read in one sitting. I could not put it down. It was such a good time, and I am so excited to talk about it. So, welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hi, I'm Hache. I'm a Brazilian author and translator, and my novella, But Not Too Bold, will come out by Thor on February. It's it's a little bit hard to describe. It's a short story, but I usually don't know how to explain the genre of it. To me, it's a fantasy, but I've seen a lot of people describe it as horror. It's a little bit of a fairy tale, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening with genres here. I feel like it pulls from a lot of different traditions, but I sort of saw it as a fantasy too. Before we talk about the book itself, could you tell us a little bit about your career and how you got to this project? Where did it start?
Sure. I always liked writing, but I never really considered publishing until about 2018, where I discovered short fiction magazines. I saw that international magazines usually are paid and they have more reach. I like the idea of being able to read other authors from many different countries.
Mm.
So I I didn't really write short stories back then, but I thought why not? So I started publishing short fiction. Um, but I prefer longer stories, um, either novels or novellas. And I, with this particular book, I published it first in Portuguese. I think 2021. I don't remember now, but I had the opportunity of sending it out in English. Like I translated it myself, and it got accepted. So it was just a story that I wrote to be a really short novella because I was writing shorter stuff at the time. And this is where I am now.
Great. Yeah, I really love that, it is a novella, so it's on the shorter side, but you do so much in that short space. You do so much interesting world building and character development. So could we start off by talking about Dahlia? I love her as a character, and I'd love if you could explain the Keeper of the Keys and how you shaped her character.
Well, it started out because Bluebeard is my favorite fairy tale since I was a child. I didn't want it to be a retelling, but I want the very idea started with something that reminded me of Bluebeard, so I knew I had to have keys in the story. Um, so Dahlia was kind of born out of that, out of trying to find a line of thought to have keys. And I knew I wanted a character to be a worker in the house. I usually prefer to write in the point of view of workers. So it was mostly I created her based on the idea that this is a character that works in this place for a long time. She was raised in this place, and it felt natural to me that she's someone who's very defined by her job and that feels mostly invisible by it, which happens a lot in work, especially when you're working with wealthier people than you are. So I started to build her character around from there, and the rest came mostly organically.
Mm. Yeah, I love that you mentioned her being invisible, the way that, workers are often invisible in their workplaces to the people that they are serving.
Yeah,
Because being seen or not being seen is a big theme in this book. It's something that affects the lady of the house very strongly. And there's a lot there too about Dahlia being seen or not being seen. So could you talk about the lady of the capricious house, how you shaped her and her relationship to Dahlia?
Yes, of course. Well, I love spiders.
Me too.
I think you can probably tell if you're. So I wanted a monster, because I also love monsters. Uh, and I wanted her to be a spider. And I felt like it would be an interesting dichotomy between the two of them. That one feels so invisible and the other is so visible by her physicality. And it was kind of built out of that and the idea of I never really like it when monsters are too humanized, either by form or personality. Obviously, we write stories and they're reflections of humans, but I wanted to play with the idea that she's born like this. She's this creature. She's not human in any way. So I wanted a monster that could not be changed. And I started to build her from this. How could the humans around her live with her and how would she see them? And the rest also came out kind of naturally as I started to connect one thing to the other.
Mm. Yeah, it generates a lot of tension, which is great in a romance, right? You always want tension there. And it creates a very interesting kind of that tension because Dahlia and Anatema have these moments of connection where, maybe it becomes easy to forget for a second who Anatema is and how scary she can be. But then there are these like non-human moments where you do remember that she is like, quote unquote, a monster. Could we talk more about tension? Because I'm very, very interested in that like push and pull, in a romance. Like things are pulling you together,
Mhm,
but also pushing you apart. And that becomes way more interesting with the horror elements. So
mhm.
can you talk about your approach to romantic tension in this book.
I think a lot about this when it's a monster romance because the person involved in it has to put a lot aside to be able to deal with a monster. I'm interested in what can put those two people or creatures together. How can you deal with what they do? In her case, well, eating people.
Yeah, a lot of
A
people.
lot of people, like, this is very normal to her. How do you deal with her views of on normality? Or how does she deal with our views of normality? I feel like the tension is mostly this difference rather than just that getting to know each other. And how do you find a middle ground between these? Because as I say, she cannot be different. We cannot judge her only by human standards. It's mostly a question of do you want to stay here or not? Because she could not want this. But
Absolutely.
since she does,
That's so interesting, and that relates in very interesting ways to this idea of being seen or not being seen. Because I think that even though, for Anatema, the stakes are raised because being seen as her real self creates, some terrible emotions in people. But there's this also need to be seen. So being seen
mhm.
is something in this book that is like very, very terrifying, but also very necessary. And that I think is like a good way of, I don't know, viewing love. Like it can be very scary, but also very necessary.
Yeah, you can form connections other than that.
Mm.
I really like this idea. How do you say? Love is mostly like that. Connections are mostly like that. Any relationship, if it gets deep, it's like that. We have to open a lot of ourselves that we don't necessarily like or that others might not like. Obviously, here it's a very enhanced version of that, but I like the idea of this for a monster too. She wants to connect, obviously, or she wouldn't even try to connect with those people. She wouldn't even try to interact with them. She would just eat them. But she tries. She wants this. It's just very hard because, as I guess many readers will feel, her appearance and behavior are not very friendly to most humans. But there's also a person in it. She also has feelings and a personality. So I'm very interested in this aspect of relationships, I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's explored so interestingly here I really do like that about her character, that as I was reading, like it's very natural to want to assign her to as either good guy or bad guy, but I think that that is an issue that you have to sidestep and not think about, because
Mhm.
she she eats people, but she does still love them, and I love the idea of her memories. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about her physical memories and her craft, because she does love her brides too, as the Bluebeard stand, but she does also eat them. So yeah, could you talk about her memories?
Yeah, I love memory as a theme. I think it's one of the things I like the most to write. And I think it's also one of those things where you start thinking as you build a character. Well, it's someone who lives for a very long time, and it's someone who's very isolated too for her physical self, but also her desire to be around people. And she's a spider, so she spins. um, so how does she keep her memories if people keep dying around her? Sometimes because of her. She clearly cares about the space she lives in, since it's such an extravagant house. So I think the idea of physical memories that she creates came from there, so she can have something to remember those people who die so easily. And I like the idea of artistry for spiders.
Yeah, I like that
So I
idea.
guess I guess to them.
Yeah. Wow. My last question is about translating, because
Mhm,
you translate your own work too, and I'm really curious about, when you approach one of your works to translate, whether it's a year or two on, or however long the time period is.
mhm.
What is it like to translate your own work? Like, do you see new aspects of your writing when you're translating it, or do you look at it in a different way? Like what is involved, I guess, like in bringing your story to a new language.
I love translating my stories, um, mostly to find the proper cadence in each language while maintaining everything as much as possible. Because sometimes you have to reward certain things to make it more faithful to the original
Mm.
instead of just doing it literally. And this is a part of translating that I really like. The story is the same, the writing is the same, but sometimes to pass the same sensation, you need to rethink the sentence. And I think this is one of the most exciting parts of it for me. And since it's mine, I have more freedom to do it than when I'm translating the work of somebody else. But it's mostly that. I don't see much difference between the languages, not not in a literal way, but when I'm writing, since I write both in English and Portuguese, and I already translated from each of them. But I think it's a very exciting process overall.
Yeah, I really love thinking about translation and how, you can choose to portray the literal truth of word by word,
Hmm.
but it might not capture the emotional truth or like the mood that you are going for. And so I like that it makes you think about the differences in culture, but also what is universal.
Yeah, I also love this aspect because you can't keep everything literal. There are different wordings and meanings in each language that changing a little bit, it's gonna be much more truthful than maintaining it. And I really love this aspect of linguistic differences.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for sharing your book with me and with our listeners. I am so excited to recommend it to everybody that I meet for the rest of my life. It's so good. Are you working on anything else right now? What's next for you?
I'm currently editing a story. I can't share it right now because it hasn't been announced yet,
Mhm.
but it's longer.
Great. Well, I'm very
And thanks
excited.
for having me.
Oh, no problem. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you and to read your work. And yeah, I'm so excited to see what's next whenever it's ready to get announced. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure.
Great. All right, listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out But Not Too Bold. By the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So head over to your favorite bookstore or library or website, wherever you like to get your books. Okay, it is time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.